Testing.
I mean, it has our logo on it.
You should hire a social media manager.
I've got like 3 of them.
I've never used one of these before. Is this right?
Yeah. Just speak real quick and see if it's picking you up.
Oh, okay.
All right, cool. Come join me up here. You haven't done one of these before, but
I have not.
okay. Give me a second. I'll make an announcement, then I'll invite you up, and I'll ask you a few questions, and then you'll start. That's the deal.
Okay.
They know who I am, and what a mess. God, I'd be such a great nothing. All right, guys. For those of you, it's your first time. Welcome to the Silicon Swamp. I'm Fred. Co-organizers are Lucy, Chuck, and Carl. So you guys have any questions about organizing, that's here. Announcements that matter. No swamp next week because there's an event here, but boy, it's a startup sprint. They are looking for technically inclined people to join, but it's almost full already. Please join if you're interested. Also, if you are a swamp person, we will consider you a swamp person if I've seen you before at the swamp, and you go and you let me know ahead of time, I'll give you a swamp t-shirt when I make them. I am not giving any promises on the quality of these shirts, how good they will look, but they will say Silicon Swamp on them.
But they are artisanal.
They are artisanal. They are handmade by yours truly. As I explore screen printing. So that's still the same deal. I don't know if that'll matter. In general, for our internet users, smash that like button, subscribe. Blaine, I'm talking about you. So that's it. We have a special guest today before we get into our actual speaker. Cy is here. Cy, I think, worked for all of us at some point in time, so we're great to have him back. Visiting us from the big state of Texas. I think that is it for our general announcements. I will say this. The Carolina Code Conference was last week. I stole swag. If you want to, it's on top of my backpack. But I was only able to steal what was left over. So, for you guys, if you want a female large Carolina Code t-shirt, it's yours. Or what?
Oh, I didn't know the other ones. Are they both large?
I think they're both large. Oh, they may. Oh, yeah, it is smaller. You're right. This one's a. You could pick whichever one of these. This one's a large. This one's a double XL. Women are smaller than me. So if you want a woman's Carolina Code Conference t-shirt for yourself or for your children or for whatever, they're here. They're free. I'll put them on the chair. You guys figure it out. All right. Without that, we'll go ahead and start. We've got our guests this week, William Scalf. Am I saying that last name right?
Yep.
All right. Come join me on stage for our awkward interview.
Is that nearly full over?
Yeah, no, it's great. It really goes with our vibe. So, William, I appreciate you joining us here. You are local to the area, as I understand it. Are you from here originally, or?
I am, yeah. I grew up in Elgin,
Elgin?
So out in Kershaw County, and I currently live in Lake Carolina.
Lake Carolina? How do you like it?
It's great.
Blythewood is okay?
Yeah.
There we go, Blythewood. What are you doing now for work?
So I work at Red Hat.
Okay.
And I'm working on Project Kessel, which I'll touch on actually at the beginning of my talk.
Cool.
It's it's a new authorization system.
All right. And how long have you been with Red Hat?
3 years.
Okay. How did you get kind of into tech?
Oh, I pretty much have been in, at least interested in tech since I was probably about 12 when I started learning to program. Was definitely heading that way. got a job as an intern at a local company.
Mhm.
Don't think it's still around anymore, but it was called Easy HR Web.
Is that still around? No, okay.
Yeah, probably not. But that was really what got me started in technology. And yeah, the rest is pretty much history.
How'd you find out about the swamp?
From Jamie Pearson, actually. So he messaged me on LinkedIn on Monday, yes, this past Monday, saying, telling me about OPA, which was last week's talk, and asking if I'd heard of that. And I was like, actually, yes, I have. We looked into that some as an option for the back end for our authorization. And we ended up choosing this other thing instead for all of these reasons.
Okay.
And he was like, you should talk about that. And I was like, cool. And then, like, by the next day, I was scheduled to come speak to y'all tonight.
And just remember, that could be you. You listeners and stuff. You also could be hurriedly scheduled. But that was a big win for Carl, who was originally our backup. I got to call him and was like, I don't know if you've started your presentation yet, but we have a willing person. So no, but you had title, booked out some time to work on it.
That's about where I was at.
I do appreciate 2 weeks. I do appreciate that you took not only came to talk, but also on short notice. And that's also really good because it does follow up really well with last week's talk. So
Yeah.
This is a really timely time to do it, not just because we needed a speaker this week, but also because we could have scheduled you later, but this makes so much sense to have it happen. So I'm really happy about it. You probably are working at one of the probably from our community, one of the largest code outfits. So what's it like working at Red Hat?
Oh, it's really interesting. So giant company, of course, doesn't necessarily feel that giant, though, because you work in kind of relatively small, like 2 pizza teams. But it's basically like anything else zoomed out. It's just all your vendors work for the same people you do, basically.
Okay. So Red Hat, is an open source company.
Yep.
What's it like, in your opinion, working for a company that is open source like that? Is that a cool thing and a value add for you, or?
Yeah, it's really neat. Like, actually, most of what I do now is open on GitHub. And so, in fact, if y'all want to star Project Kessel, you can actually do that and watch it as it develops. It also means that a lot of what we work with are open source projects that we can actually go and contribute to. And we are, in fact, encouraged to do that, which is pretty sweet.
Very sweet. What I guess my last question that I usually ask people is, what are some areas of technology, whether code or not, that you're currently kind of excited about? Even if you don't work on it, just stuff you...
Yeah. So the Godot game engine is super exciting. It's an open source game engine that's punching way above its weight in all the best ways. It's really cool to see that happening, and I've even made some very small contributions
That's very
that
cool.
are part of that.
That's interesting. I think we've gotten some interest in having like video game speakers. I know a couple people in that world. Maybe that is something we'll work on trying to get a little bit more for future swamps. But all right, look, the stage is going to be yours. I appreciate it. The only question we have now is, are you a questions during or a questions after kind of guy?
Normally more of a questions after, but for this one, please stop me during. This is going to be one of the roughest presentations I have ever given.
That's what we're talking about. All right, man. I appreciate it. I'll take the chair.
All right. So do I just like...
I'll give you a thing.
He'll give you a thumbs up, finger point, gun pointer. I don't know what the deal is. Our producer, Carl. And that's it. I'm done for the week. I'm going to go home. You guys should ship me my laptop. I'm hot. I have a hot mic on while I'm saying all my jokes. Everybody on YouTube is going to judge. Last week, we tried to stream some of this on Insta. And literally because I like added her. I just wanted to see what was that.
Sorry, just trying to make sure it shows all of my layouts.
Yeah.
Screening.
I like the idea that we might have like an alternative screen. We just be digging around with that stuff while people are talking. Like, I don't know if you guys watch the Nickelodeon coverage for football games. Right. It's hilarious. It's a really good time. We might, when swamp grows to that size. Nothing says swamp.
Why? Football game? Is that what you're saying? Is the swamp gonna put on a Thursday night football game?
I mean, I'm 280 pounds. I might be a lot more competitive now than I was in high school.
The dream's still alive.
I was 100 pounds in high school. That's what my offensive line coach told me. Glad you lost weight. I could have used you.
The game. You know, they have all.
Let's play an 8 on Thursday.
Oh, it's right there. With OBS.
I know, right?
That,
I got it figured out. Yeah.
No, I'm doing color commentary while
Yeah,
it's
if Schutz and Woods were something. That means I'd actually have to learn that.
Oh. All right.
Quarterback.
Cool. All right, let's go. So, hi, I'm William. We already covered some of this in the interview portion. So I'm originally from Columbia. I've been doing identity and access management software for about 10 years, give or take, a little more, actually. Good chunk of which was at SoftDocs. A couple of familiar faces here. Looking at this to remind myself who I am. All right, yeah, and currently working on Project Kessel, which is a just big chunk of buzzwords, multi-tenant, multi-service, authorization system. But no, it's pretty cool. All right. Yeah, it is also relationship-based. It is not actually a ReBAC system, though. It sits in front of them. All right, so quick terminology check. I don't know how many people here are like really into identity and access management, but I'll be using a lot of this terminology as we go. I will try to say the whole thing when they come up, because PIP, PEP, and PEP don't really mean anything. But a policy administration point would be where you actually change policy. This is typically an API of some kind. Policy information point would be what makes information about the policy available. Decision points make some decision based on the policy, and enforcement points actually do something based on a decision. This might sound needlessly pulled apart, but they are actually different sometimes. All right. So what exactly is authorization? What are we talking about? Might seem a little bit basic, but it's the access and identity and access management, right? What are you allowed to do? For the most part, this is a risk management type thing. You could just let everyone do whatever they want, but this way you can have some control around that. Y'all know why you do that. So, breaking it down a little bit more technically, you've got these 4 questions that authorization needs to be able to answer. Obviously, can this user do this thing to this thing? Yes or no? Which operations can this user do to this thing? Which things can this user do this thing to? And which users can do this thing to this thing? Which just sounds like business logic, doesn't it? Like check is basically an if, right? And listing operations would be multiple ifs. And well, listing resources is basically a search or really any query. And we've all seen audit tables. Like this is all kind of rudimentary, right? And maybe. So if you have a monolithic application, you may be doing all of this just in your code. Policy administration point may be an admin page of some kind. Your information point may be that same admin page. There may not really be any more to it than that. Your decision points are maybe literally ifs in your code, and your enforcement points are those same ifs, and there's not much more to it than that. But even so, broken access control is #1 on the OWASP top 10. And there are a bunch of reasons for that, right? You may have checks that are just missing. Actually, in my own practice, that seems to be one of the most common causes of relatively high-level vulnerabilities in otherwise security mature applications. Yeah, also inconsistency between list and check is a challenge, right? If your list is correct, but your check is not, then you have things that are actually allowed, and it's not really clear to the eye that that's the case. That's also very common. And in fact, missing checks tend to hide there. And there are logic errors and things like that that can happen as well. And segmentation makes things much more complex. If you're not working with a monolith, and I mean, realistically in 2024, you're probably not, right? Show of hands, if your company has one application that's one giant module. Like, actually, though?
Monoliths are coming back, dude.
All right, well, I've got something for y'all, too. But, you know, for everyone else, right, these are some challenges that you face here. So access checks, you know, you may have data that another service owns that's necessary for making a decision. You also may have decisions that depend on access to resources and other services, and you don't have the logic or data unless you duplicate it or give yourself access to it to make those decisions. And simply building the logic into the app really isn't sufficient at that point. And so you might have something that looks a little bit like this. And actually, for my SoftDocs friends, this may look familiar, and I apologize. But in my defense, the paper this is all based on wasn't released until 2019. But yeah, so you may have something like this, where services have decision and enforcement built into them, but there's actually another service somewhere that's handling the administration and information about policy. Also, some things to consider. Say you're using Google Meet, and you send a Google Drive link to the attendees in the meeting. Google Meet knows whether or not they have access to that document and can actually prompt you to share with them if they don't. How do you think something like that works? And further, if let's say the Drive team added a new way to grant access to documents, should that impact Meet in really any way at all? All right, so what we're actually here to talk about is relationship-based access control, which the idea is you can model your access policy entirely as data. And your data is a big graph. You've got your things, you've got relationships between your things. Really only your relationships are actually stored. But the idea is that if a valid path exists between an actor and a resource, then they have some permission to that resource. The details are more implementation specific, but that's generally the idea. And this can actually reduce all of your authorization logic to graph reachability problems if you can construct the graph. And you're probably already doing something like this in your code. If you have code like this, if exists select, where ID ends select, and a bunch of inner joins, what you are essentially doing is checking for whether a path exists through a graph. And if so, they have access, and if not, they don't. Whoop. All right. Yeah, a little bit rough here.
Well, I mean, I guess I'll throw out like a question, right?
Yeah.
Which is, certainly you could model everything as a graph and get like a relationship. But like you said, like you could model this similar functionality with something like SQL query. Like,
Yeah.
you know, and maybe you're gonna talk about later, and if so, like, just tell us. But isn't there some advantage to being like, well, we can all write SQL, whereas like walking a graph is sort of a somewhat more complicated computer sciencey problem, where it's like,
Well, it
you can only
is.
use like this one tool, even if it's not perfect. Isn't there some accessibility aspect that makes it advantageous?
For this problem, I'm going to argue no.
Okay.
And because, well, we're going to get to, you're not going to build a tool to walk the graph yourself.
Right.
It's actually really cool. But all right, yeah. So there's some advantages to. I think I'm missing a slide, unfortunately. Is that? Oh well. We'll just go with it. So externalizing this problem to a dedicated service that's able to do all graph reachability calculations has some advantages, like enabling a PDP as a service model. So you could actually have a service now that has this graph, is optimized to walk the graph, completely take over all that if then else logic, all the query logic, all of that, because it's not application specific anymore. Yeah, so there's nothing specific about it, just graphs. So this also allows for some very simplified APIs. Like literally in most of these engines, there's an API that the parameters are like actor, action, resource, and it returns true or false, whether it's permitted or not. Like it really is that simple. Yeah, and because it's that simple, you can also do things like ask questions about resources you don't own. So something like Meet being able to ask, hey, do these people have access to this document? Well, it can just issue that query. And it doesn't need to know anything about the graph between those things. It just gets an answer. Does that help with that question?
Yeah, I mean, in general, right?
Yeah.
The answer's for sure.
All right. So here's kind of a neat diagram of kind of an extreme example, I guess, of what that could look like. You could actually have an authorizing proxy that calls some ReBAC service where your enforcement point is out here, your decision point is over here, completely separate from all the applications. And all they're responsible for doing is populating the parts of the graph that they're responsible for, potentially via this. So there are different ways to organize the graph, of course. It's whatever you say it is. But yeah, it's kind of interesting that you can pull it all the way out to a proxy. And there are actually proxies that do this, like Authorino, and I think Quadrant is one as well. Wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but it's interesting that it's possible. Yeah, so this is another thing. So graph reachability problems are a computer sciencey thing with lots of really cool potential optimizations. They are fractal. So any graph reachability problem is actually a superset of other graph reachability problems. And because you can decompose them that way, and each subproblem has the same signature as every other problem, they're like truly recursive, you can do things like parallelizing the subproblems, caching the results of a specific subproblem and applying them to an entirely different problem that just happens to overlap with it, and things like that. Yeah, and there tends to be some locality to authorization problems in general, because you're going to have users who are the same people with access to roughly the same things, interacting with similar things. Your cache hit rate can be extremely high, especially on those subproblems. And yep. And yeah, you can actually see extremely low latencies. We've done load testing with a database with literally tens of billions of relationships and thousands of requests per second with like 80 millisecond response times.
What kind of memory?
Oh, it was using about 360 gigs of RAM.
So not gonna work on my Raspberry
No, this was intended to back a cloud, like an entire cloud. All right, so the Zanzibar paper. So I've made references to a paper a couple of times. So Google developed something internally that they call Zanzibar, which was kind of the archetypal relationship-based access control system. And they didn't open source it, and instead kind of went a roundabout way and wrote a paper about how they did it, and they open sourced that. And so now there's a couple dozen of these things where people have read the paper and then they went and did the thing too, and those are open source. There's a bunch of those. We'll be talking about SpiceDB in a minute, but there's others like OpenFGA, Permify, OSO, something or other. There's a whole bunch of them. Yeah, globally distributed, that's cool. Low latency, caching, deduplication, yep. Causal consistency is kind of an interesting computer science-y thing. New enemy problem. They talk a lot about that in the paper. Short answer being it's extremely cacheable, does lots and lots of caching. What happens when somebody becomes your enemy and you take their permissions away? There's potentially a time period where that's a problem for you. And there's a thing built in called causal consistency where if you take the permissions away, you can use a cookie that you get to make sure that that change is applied to subsequent requests. All right, so SpiceDB. We are about halfway through the slides now, and we're actually talking about the thing. This is why I didn't want it in the title. But all right, so yeah, it is a feature-complete implementation of the Zanzibar model. It's not the only one, but in my kind of our opinion, it is probably the most mature and the most complete. Though there's a lot of interesting stuff happening with others, and we are keeping an eye on the community in general. And I mentioned Kessel. It is intended to be able to switch between these, although so far SpiceDB is pretty good. Yep, it's got a strongly typed schema model, caching. Yep, we talked about that some. It does have some ReBAC features, by the way. So last week, y'all heard about OPA, which is a policy-based thing. It's very attribute-based access control leaning. SpiceDB has that as well, sort of. The idea is that you can attach data to a request or to a relationship and have conditional rules to make that relationship count or not. So you can actually have some degree of conditionality. It's not super common that you actually need that, but we have seen some use cases for that, like CVSS scores, giving someone access to just vulnerabilities below a certain risk and things like that. But almost always in access control, you're looking for equalities, not inequalities. And for that, you would just use relationships. All right, so we are actually almost at the end now. So here's just some random SpiceDB stuff, showing kind of what the schema language looks like. You can create types with definitions. Relations are essentially foreign keys, and permissions are essentially computed foreign keys. So with something like this, you've also got like type unions. So you've got like a resource can be granted reader or writer or viewer to a user or the members of a group, essentially. A group can have members, and if you have writer, you can write and view, whereas if you have only viewer, you can only view. So that kind of shows roughly what a policy might look like.
Is this like a domain-specific language that SpiceDB uses, or is
This is SpiceDB specific, yes. Other tools have their own domain-specific languages generally. We are actually working on a transpiler where you could use a high-level language slightly higher than this and transpile to different ones.
I just think of this like a language I just wasn't familiar with. Is this Ruby?
No, it's specific to SpiceDB. And then you've got, yeah, some data over here, which also I think I didn't have the slide that says the shape of relationships. So relationships are always from a resource to a subject. Subjects are not necessarily actors. They may be intermediary objects. But yeah, so relationships go resource toward the user, essentially. And so we could say, you know, you've got some gal as viewer on some resource, and the members of the viewers group have view access on yet another resource, and viewer by group is a member of viewers. And then down here, we can say, all right, well, who can view yet another? Well, it's these two for these reasons. So it's showing kind of one of the queries that you can do. And I actually have a link here because I thought I was going to be standing at a laptop, and I am in fact not. Yeah, if you want to hit it, sure. That opens up the editor that this is from. Oh, what happened?
This is what happens when I only crawl the. Oh, right. My fault, man. There, we're back. Now I can find it. I tried to be helpful. I just made it so much worse.
Yeah, just skip.
Well, doesn't it want to check permissions? It's the whole time.
Oh, it didn't load. That's unfortunate. So it should have been a link that would open the version that I was working with before, but
oh well. Like give you just like a general playground.
Yeah, but so this is a neat tool for playing with SpiceDB. You can write a schema here. You can click on test relationships and put in data that you would like in the database. This looks very similar to what I just had there. And you can actually click down here for Z terminal. And it gives you in browser a terminal where you can use the command line client to run queries and things like that. Yeah.
Should I run anything?
I mean,
is there a hello world that somebody not
yeah.
smart like me could run?
Yeah, let's do, this is actually kind of cool. Let's do Z relationship. Oh, I'm sorry, it's permission, not relationship. Permission. Look up subjects as one word. I'm just doing this entirely, subjects plural. Watch me completely bomb this syntax.
Because I have to do the typing. You can come type for me.
Yeah, I'll do that.
I don't mind other people touching the laptop. I know how hard it would be for me to dictate Python code.
Oh, yeah. Whoa. Oh, it's up there. Okay. Let me actually just double check while we're extremely live.
That's all right. Is anybody? All right.
Ah, it's actually look up dash
hang with
subjects. Yeah.
I'm almost positive one of them. And the other one's you.
Oh, it's view. User not found? Oh, no colon. There we go. So this is something kind of cool that is kind of a unique Zanzibar feature. It's actually indexed forward and backward. So not only can it tell you what resources someone has access to, it can actually tell you who has access to a resource, which is really cool for like auditing and permissions analysis and things like that.
What? Okay, I mean, kind of a random question. Are there any like shortcomings to this technique? Sites?
Yeah.
Mathematically more complicated than SQL.
Which I'm actually not sure it's mathematically more complicated than SQL, just less familiar. In fact, it is, in fact, using SQL tables behind it. This is most likely running in memory, but you can put Postgres behind it. They recommend CockroachDB behind it, but it does actually need a database behind it. But as far as like downsides, probably the biggest one is your graph has to represent your authorization logic. That is not necessarily simple, especially if you have things that are maybe outside your control that you care about. Good example of this would be if you have users coming in from external SSOs that are not your SSO, and they're bringing claims with them like the groups they're a member of in a directory server somewhere that's not yours. Well, you're not going to know that changed until they log in. And so you would have to put that in your graph, but you won't be able to until you get it. It also means that your graph can get quite large because every object that you care to authorize against has to be there. The systems are designed to handle that, but it can get large, it can get complex because the systems then that need that data to be tracked have to be able to provide it somehow. It's common to have something like listening to a Kafka topic or something, so you're not like directly writing to SpiceDB. But those are things that you may not normally need to do, and so you would have to think about things like that. Also, filtering. So this is a pro and a con. Like, let's say you want to show someone a list of things they have access to, right? That's a very common thing to need to do. Well, SpiceDB can't do that. What it can do is tell you what those things are, and then it's up to you to present those to the user. And so that can be complex. I actually meant to have slides on that. There are different ways of doing that. One is actually to just load them from your database and call it for each one. It'd be like, hey, can they see this? And if not, toss it. Sure. Right, so it's which way you do it. So I only mentioned one, so that would be checking for each item. The other would be you ask SpiceDB for the list, and then you apply that to your query. Which one you go with kind of depends on your expected cardinality. If you expect things like your other query parameters, like your search criteria or something like that, to be more selective than their permissions, that's when you would want to check for each item that matched. Versus if you expect their permissions to be much more selective, you might start with SpiceDB, get what they have access to, and then filter that further.
And you mentioned earlier about the latency. What is
Typically very small, as long as it's, you have to keep your network latency low because it can't be faster than that. But typically we see around 5 milliseconds. We've seen as high as 80 under just absolutely brutal load. But that was with a very beefy server. It's fast though, is the main thing. It's very fast. It works in memory as much as it can and can actually, like I mentioned, cache the solutions to sub-problems. I also didn't mention, it has a really cool feature where it, because the parameters to a problem are actually hashable, and that would be a stable hash, you can actually have it from your client even hash the request to determine which server to send it to, so that the same request would always go to the same server. And then from there, as they're fanning out subproblems, they do the same thing. They hash the subproblem that they want to submit to determine which server to send it to. So if any of them see that same subproblem again, they'll automatically send it to the same place and more likely get a cache hit.
Is a cache hits ever take like a really mathy approach? Like if I have a very large graph, can I essentially define like a manifold where I'm saying that all the objects under this manifold in this space, and as long as I like have an edge, like a vertex that crosses it, the permission's like is like denied or not?
So you can't specifically tell it like beyond here there be dragons.
Yeah.
There is so of course it can cache the answer to that, right? Once it finds that one time. And then anything that tries to go down that same edge again, it already knows there's nothing there. Or if you have something that you want to always be true, there is actually a shortcut that's like a wildcard. And if it ever meets a wildcard, it considers that complete. I'm not sure that answers your question.
No, I mean it certainly does. I mean, because to an extent, like yes and no, like there is some things, but it's mostly looking at the relationships along vertexes, like actual paths.
Yeah.
Middle of cache, not like, oh, there's a cluster over here that are in this like what we call like a manifold space mathematically. I think actually your analogy, there be dragons, is quite good. Like if you cross this barrier, you're in or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's cool to know. I'm just kind of curious, like how, you know, if you're using graph stuff, like how mathy can we get with it in our like cache hits and stuff?
Yeah, it's quite smart. I don't know how it decides which subproblems to cache because, like, obviously, if you have a chain, right, where it's like a whole bunch of edges, and then you get to a whole bunch of stuff over here.
Yeah.
At which point does it say, okay, I'm going to cache this one? I actually don't know.
What's it? I mean, just kind of because you work on this, kind of, what's it written? Is it like
It's Go.
Basic.
Basic. No, it's written in Golang.
Okay, so like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Don't pretend like you didn't sneak in here.
Yeah, so if you want to use SpiceDB, it's a container on Docker Hub. So yeah, you can just pull it, it goes.
How big of a container on Docker Hub? Because I made this mistake.
It's not giant. It's I couldn't tell you exactly. I want to say it's like in the tens of megs.
Oh, okay.
It's might be 100 megs. It's not huge.
Our company, we have what we call the old size special. It's a 7 gigabyte Docker.
Oh no. Is it a Windows container? What? How is it that big?
It has an AI model.
That would make a difference.
It's
Sure.
Catch all, like, this will run it. When you're testing out stuff, and it was a big fun aside, but it's actually, we had some project and we just couldn't get it to work, and we just kept adding things onto it. And we finally got one Docker container that would work, and we still haven't. And it's sort of like the emergency, you know, break glass. For some reason, I can't get these things to work with whatever. Use this beast.
But yeah, it's a straightforward Docker image. It can run in memory if you just want to play with it, and so it doesn't necessarily need a database. But if you want it to persist, it can work with Postgres, Cockroach, whatever you got.
For people that are interested, because now we've had two speakers talk about access and permission control. For people that are maybe like new to programming, they're interested in this field, maybe like, hey, this is like, do you have any suggestions for them on like how they might get into it, things that they should learn, like what employers are looking for?
Ooh, I'd say one big thing is a lot of GitHub projects have started putting good first issue as a tag on tickets and looking for those, because you can actually search by that. That's a really good way to get involved in these sorts of community projects, and they all do it. Like even the really like computer sciencey, high performance things will still have good first issues. And those are good ways to get hands-on.
You were at Soft Docs, rebuilding everything, part of that falls first thing. You go directly to this as the starting point, or
Yeah, essentially, so you would still need a management interface of some kind. You would still want to build that separately. That's not something it can do. It's not intended to do that. It solves graph reachability problems. Um, but yeah, I would definitely. And just thinking back to some of the problems that we had to solve and challenges that we faced and things, they're things it's good at.
I feel like the interesting thing here is part of those cases wouldn't necessarily think about relationships.
But we were doing it that way.
And you're like,
But we were doing it that way.
exactly.
Yeah.
We're thinking about that. But this is, I can see how this would be incredibly powerful.
Oh yeah.
In your words, in Charles isn't here to defend himself. We'll let him comment in the Discord. How would you say? How is this different than what we saw last week in like a concise way? And then also, do you think there's a time where the solution we saw last week is maybe the right answer and this is a better answer if you're doing? What are kind of those cases?
Yeah. So I have not directly worked with OPA. I was part of evaluating it. So we did look at it a little bit. We ended up not actually putting it into use. The reasons why were that it seems to be based mainly on if you have rules that you need evaluated. And that's just not really the kind of use case that we have running a hybrid cloud. For the most part, we're more concerned with all these relationships between things and being able to find the paths. And that's what SpiceDB is really good at. But we do have a team using OPA for, it is a build pipeline. And OPA is there for creating policies for things that should be allowed to be built or should not, and for things like that that are very, very rules-based.
I felt like just watching Charles' presentation last week, a little bit that it also might be something applied to just kind of basic business rule validation.
Oh yeah, you can.
That was very interesting.
Yeah.
Not wandering around.
I'm sorry, I should have been taking a mic to people.
Oh.
Once the ground down. Carl's over here. He's crawling
So
You want me to get back up here too?
So I'm really curious as far as just the amount of resources it would take in a typical production implementation of this. Do you have a sense of that based on the work you've done so far?
It is entirely based on your load. So the minimum resource usage is tens of megs of memory, whatever core utilization, right? But it depends entirely on your load. So the more relationships you have in your graph, the more memory it will use generally. It doesn't preload the graph or anything, but it loads what it needs. And yeah, CPU-wise, it's very CPU efficient, but it is a CPU-bound application, oddly enough, because it's so aggressively caching. For the testing we did to prove that it would stand up to like running a cloud, those resources were not what you would realistically need, but it was like a database server, one server with 360 gigs of RAM and I think like 48 cores and something like 8 VMs that each had about a dozen cores.
Can you take something like, think about one of our largest customers, SoftDocs, 10 million or 20 million documents, 10 million people.
Sure.
Any sense at all what it would take to represent that?
A good bit less. honestly. Because if
Okay.
you think about it, like a tuple, like one of these tuples is basically a string that's probably the size of a UUID, and that's roughly a relationship, right?
Yeah.
10 million of those is not much.
Very cool.
Our question from our very active Discord community. This one comes from Charles.
So he's watching.
Yeah, he's watching right now.
Oh, that's
Like he's
cool.
on the Discord. He says, "First, you're wrong." No,
Hey?
no. He says it's all nice stuff. He mostly just glowing recommendations. But he said, "Question for William: One topic that has come up with a lot of OPA is users wanting to connect existing legacy data sources to their auth-z policies. Imagine an organization with a legacy proprietary database that has certain user data in it. How would you address that with Kessel/SpiceDB?"
Okay, so we actually are doing that using another of our products, but of course we're going to eat our dog food as much as Microsoft does. But we have a product called Debezium that's good for that, where it can track changes to a database and push that to a Kafka topic. But ultimately, it's not going, like SpiceDB isn't going to plug into your database. It doesn't really do that. But you could have another service, or your application itself could write relationships to SpiceDB. Same as you would do with OPA, honestly. With OPA, you have like an API to say, hold this data for me. It would be essentially the same problem.
You're welcome, Charles. I'm coming to you, man.
Just a general question, William, as far as thinking about databases and third-party databases, SQL Server or something like that. Is there any support within those solutions to tie into SpiceDB so that you think about zero trust? We want to, we want to absolutely guarantee that the person or the thing that's accessing that data is not or is authorized to that data. Is there anything there to help solve that problem?
So are you asking about loading relationships into SpiceDB, or are you asking about restricting queries?
Restricting queries and thinking about conversations we've had in the past around row level authorization.
Yeah. So when you're talking about queries into the database, probably not. But through your application, that would be where you would come back to pre-filter, post-filter, things like that.
Yeah. Okay.
But I mean, there's nothing stopping them from adding that to it.
Anything else? Anybody see any YouTube questions? Oh, you got a question.
So with this, with Kessel in particular, where does this fit within your organization, and what sorts of things do you anticipate it sort of gluing together?
Okay, so I'll need to explain a little bit more about Kessel to be able to answer that. I was kind of avoiding talking about it too much. So Kessel's purpose is to be inventory and authorization for Red Hat Cloud. And so it's able to track all the important things that all of your customers have on premises and on cloud, and give them the ability to self-service access to those things and do access checks for whatever services they're running against those things. It is kind of the final boss of IAM software. But as far as where it fits in for Red Hat, essentially that, so that if you're using like RHEL, you're actually able to hook into Kessel from that theoretically. That doesn't work yet. Initially, it'll be all of your console.redhat.com things are going to start hooking into that soon to do access management. But it's that kind of thing. Are you a Red Hat user? Okay.
He's a Ubuntu guy. Hard pass. All right. Any other questions? Anything from the Discord, from our moderator?
Charles says this has been very informative.
Charles said, "Good job."
Nice.
I just wanted that for the YouTube.
Tell Charles thank you.
Yeah. Your mic, so you can just say it. If there are no other questions, like William, thank you so much. A round of applause for that. Remember, guys, no swamp next week. We're back. We're back on the 12th. Paul's going to talk about domain-specific language that he used for manga translation stuff, serif. It should be a fun talk. I think it'll be interesting. So that'll be Paul Starr on the 12th. So very exciting. Little change of pace too. Different kind of cool project from our community. So I'm excited about that. And all right, everybody have a happy Labor Day. Woo!